Hello, and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. Today, we're going to be talking about a trend that's getting very relevant in policy circles and funding circles around colleges and universities about the whole return on investment of a college degree. What's it worth? And I know that's happening, although in a slightly different context in the UK. So we're going to compare between the US and the UK and the various ways that it's known, the college premium. And, it's not always return on investment, but we're going to explore that subject because it's driving a lot of the policy moving forward. Before we get to that, I guess I wanted to give our listeners and viewers sort of a heads up. It turns out I've had the startling discovery that if you name episodes based on obscure lyrics or literary quotes, and then you eschew any kind of thumbnail on the videos other than just the logo, it's not optimal for distribution of a podcast. So it's only taken me 18 months to discover this fact. I might actually write something about that. So what you guys will notice is we're going to have a new, much more descriptive way of what we're talking about, but hopefully you guys are going to not want to go too far in terms of making it overly promotional or cheesy, but I might leave that up to you guys if you have some ideas on. I'm not sure which of you two is the marketing expert in this regard.
It took a two-part marketing episode for you to have your Emmaus Roads kind of experience.
I think I've destroyed any reputation I may have ever had about not being cheesy. So,
well, to be honest, the research for the marketing episodes
continues.
Did get me involved, and then you notice something. It's like, I know that's true, but you start watching it. And I guess then I started having to accept, wait, every single step I'm taking in the production here goes against what works. So maybe I'm being a little bit too stubborn.
Do you remember the time that we had a post on the newsletter that had porn and the word porn in the title? Which your daughter, the marketing expert, pointed out was not a good idea afterwards.
Not a good way to get that to be promoted. So maybe we'll have an anti-marketing episode at some point, and we'll share our secrets with the world. So we're doing that. Some other production notes. So for the first time, we're working on an interview podcast, and we're not, this podcast is not intended to be interview based. But in this case, and particularly leading up with the conference in July, we had an opportunity to talk to Rajay Nayak, who first of all is introduced us. And so we joke that he's sort of the godfather of the podcast. But also he's worked in UK and US and other direct online education, and it gave an opportunity for me to hear his perspective. And then we're going to be talking about that. You two in particular will be talking about that at the conference in July. So note those two things are coming up. And then after that episode, with the LMS and VLE conferences, users conferences coming up in July, there's Anthology Together that's going to be a doozy. And then the following week, you have D2L Fusion and InstructureCon, and then Moodle Moot Globals in September. But leading into these main conferences, we're going to have an extended episode. It's going to be longer than our typical 45 minutes, talking about the state of the LMS VLE market and what we're looking for at the conferences, although Neil will be looking for it from afar. And yeah, exactly. You'll be looking online. We'll term it, if you were going to be there, what would you have been looking for? Maybe that'll work.
Yep, thanks. That helps with the FOMO.
and actually, next week I'm going to be at the THE conference. So if anybody's going to that, come find me.
So when is that conference?
I
know it's changing.
It's the 9th, 10th, and 11th of June.
And that's no more changes on time and location you expect for that conference?
I think we're set now. And I'm going to be talking also about online learning as well. So and moderating a session on security and AI.
Hey, well, we have an overlap because Kevin and I, mostly Kevin, is moderating a generative AI and governance summit that EDUCAUSE is putting on in Minneapolis next week. So a week and a day or sometime next week.
So while you're in Minneapolis, I'll be in Salt Lake. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Neil, do you have anything exciting that's happening with you?
No, not really. That's the short answer.
Okay, well, we'll go with that. All right, so let's jump into our main topic. Here in the US, I mean, I was trying to, I don't have time to do research and know when things started, but you might argue that the gainful employment regulations that were promulgated back in the Obama administration, it was one of the first main items that was looking at program level measurements of what a student's earning and debt level was, and using that as an accountability metric on whether they could accept federal financial aid. In reality, it was really a mechanism to go after the for-profits, but it established this, what is the return on investment? Over time, there's been increasing talk about, and it's not just talk, students are aware of the cost of a college education, the debt they're taking on in a way that they weren't before the 2010s, say. And so that raises the question, is it a worthwhile investment? It's looking at return on investment. So if I'm a student and I want to make an investment in my college education, what should I expect to get out of it economically in terms of increased earnings? It's also called the college premium, and it's also very much tied up, at least in the US, with accountability, a mechanism to hold institutions accountable for whether or not graduates of programs actually get some sort of economic value out of this. So this is just happening all over the place, and it's driving a lot of our policy, but also a lot of student decision making in a way that it didn't used to be doing before. So before we get into individual items, that's sort of the, I wouldn't call it the origin story, but where it's the zeitgeist story around ROI in the U.S. Did I miss any major setup, Morgan, that
Well, I
you
think
would see?
that sums it up quite nicely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess I will point out one other thing. This is something that's one of the rare moments of bipartisanship in the U.S. where both the Democrats and the Republicans are calling for the same concept of institutional accountability and looking at earnings, debt, student wages after a program. It's all very similar concepts. So, Neil, why is this a topic of interest in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think about all of a range of kind of bigger picture things that have made scrutiny of higher education, particularly in that form, a kind of thing. I think over here, some of the things that are happening around that kind of thing are related, I think, to the economy. There's a general political narrative that's kind of quite anti-university from particular ends of the political spectrum. And I think over time there's been that sense in which, we had, when the Blair government came in, this target for 50% of students to go to university. And we're coming out the other end of that thinking actually, have we got to a stage where degrees are required for jobs that aren't necessary and we're loading students with debt? So there's probably very similar reasons why there's that kind of level of scrutiny, but it's been there for a while from the Conservative government in terms of scrutiny of higher education, its value, and they introduced degree apprenticeships in the mid 2010s as, look, this is another way of studying for a degree whilst you're in work, you're not saddled with debt, and some of the ministers behind that were really strong advocates of it. So I think, in a way, there's a whole range of different reasons why there's a level of scrutiny here. But I think it also feels like there's a bit of a seesaw effect of 20 odd years ago, it was about getting more people into higher education under different economic and global times. And now the seesaw's kind of gone the other way of oh, hang on a minute. we've got a lot of people going to university. There's a lot of debt behind it. But I think those are the general things that come to mind just off the bat.
I'm glad you brought up the debt, because that is one of the huge drivers in the U.S. is the level of student debt, which is what, $1.7 trillion in student debt right now. And there's sort of a view, some of this comes out as anti-higher education, but a lot of it comes out even pro-higher education. There is a lot of who's at fault, but there's also sort of the, well, who's incentivized to actually do a better job type of driver for what we're doing. Given this broad change, and Morgan, I want to start with you, just overall, just give me your gut feel. Are you glad that this has become a public discussion in a way that it wasn't at all back in the 2000s? Is it a good thing?
I think it is, because I think higher ed goofed up in not paying attention to it. You hear stories about leaders of higher ed saying, we're not preparing students for their first job, we're preparing them for their fifth. So we don't want to get involved in the messy stuff of what happens right away. And so I think it is a good thing, because, there is convincing data that if students are underemployed in their first couple of jobs, it takes them a long time to recover. For the readers, Phil has a degree in engineering. I have a PhD in political science, and Neil, I believe, has a degree in jazz music. So we probably have some slightly different perspectives than you.
I do like how you pointed out the PhD aspect of it. And mine has got the lowly masters behind it as well.
Well, I'm the youngest of 5 children, and most of them left in their 14, 15. So I felt I had to get a whole family's worth of higher education, so
There was a quota.
Yes, yeah, so I used to scare small children by telling them I was in the 27th grade.
Friends of mine were very keen that I did a PhD in jazz on the basis that they could then call me Dr. Jazz.
So, but you looked at the return on investment.
Yeah, return on investment on a PhD in jazz is, probably fairly limited.
Yeah. Well, being an engineer, I look at problems first. I naturally think of, well, what needs to be fixed or improved. So I'm going to start out this way by looking at some of the negative sides of this. Like you, I think it's a good thing that we're having this conversation now, and that there's a public debate about it in a way that before it was this naive, everybody needs to go to college. We need to have more, financing through federal student loans, but never saying, is this smart and is it make a good decision for students? So overall, I'm glad about that. And I'm also think that it's a good move that it's shifting the conversation away from just institutions. I go to Duke and, is that worth it? And getting more into, yes, but what's your major? So it's moving to a program level discussion, which I think is very relevant. And so I think that's a healthier aspect as well. Having said that, one of the things that's become a very unhealthy part of the media coverage and the discussion is when you do see these efforts to say, well, what is the return on college? Is it worth it? What's the college premium? And then you might start out with this whole richer set of data around programs, because you might have a different answer depending on the programs. The defensive mechanism, at least in the US, way too often is to aggregate the data and say, yes, college is still worth it. The data proves college is worth it. And
lumping engineers and jazz musicians and political scientists all in the same bucket.
Exactly. But it's also like, you should not look deeper. College is worth it. And if you're trying to look too deep, you're trying to attack higher ed as opposed to ask a natural question. And then I think those conversations just go off the rails and are not helpful, because very few people are actually questioning, does the concept of higher education make sense? Yeah, I'm sure there's some fringe, but that's way on the side. It's now a program level distinction, and coming up with your response being, yes, college aggregated together, that's when it becomes an unhealthy conversation in my mind.
I think this is an interesting aspect of it, because I think there's the political, and maybe on the other side you could say describe it maybe as a pragmatic. I think certainly over here there's been the political element has been using this as a rod to beat universities, and not as a means of trying to rebalance higher education and training and skills in your country. And as a result, we've had, Universities UK, the big representative body over here, publish lots of data around the value of universities and, the value of getting a university degree. And you kind of have that back and forth. And I think when I agree with you guys, and I think it's broadly positive, but I think when it's driven by a political motivation that's a bit too anti-university, that's where it becomes problematic. And certainly that felt like that was the case on for the last government. I mean, actually, we had a report. I haven't had a chance to fully read it, but we had a report recently that was commissioned by the previous government. So the Institute of Fiscal Studies is kind of proposing using graduate earning data in the regulation of universities. So we have metrics already around the percentage of students that kind of continue and complete their degrees, but they're proposing a slightly more sophisticated metric than has been around previously to gauge the kind of value of a university degree based on graduate earnings over, I think, 3 to 5 years post graduation. And I think they were proposing that comes into the regulation as well. So yeah, I think the focus is a good one. But it's just tricky, because I think in general in life, the nuance of all of this stuff is just really hard. We kind of talked about our own different career paths and things. It's very difficult to kind of interpret all of that into a kind of a financial sum 3 to 5 years post university. But I think it is also difficult to do well. I think this new report does propose adjusting for different factors, but it's still very difficult to say, if an arts graduate is on 20 grand 3 years down the line, is that representative of a poor course? How does the industry, how do other factors? I just think it's very complicated. I think the good thing is the way that this might drive a more balanced education system as a whole, with different diversity of routes and different focus and a bit more vocational stuff thrown in the UK. Sorry, that was a bit of a rambling answer, but
Yeah.
Get the gist.
Well, one thing I would point out, though, I'm the one with the electrical engineering degree. I would be negative for my group because I was in the Air Force ROTC. And so I go to get my degree, get my master's, and then I went into the Air Force active duty. And at the time, I think I was making $26,000 a year. I know it'd be higher now. But for that time frame where this tends to get measured in the, I would say, 2 to 5 year range, I was making virtually nothing because it was part of going into the Air Force. It would be tricky to measure it because it's not actually capturing what's happening. And I will say that gets to another one of my biggest complaints is instead of just being an additional tool and data source to inform decision making, too many of these frameworks assume this is what it's all about. And then it becomes just too difficult to measure because I didn't do it so I could make money the first 3 to 5 years out of college. It did pay off for me long term. And that sort of gets to your point, Morgan, about, you're doing this for the 5th job that you have. I'm actually a case where that did make sense for me.
Yeah, the metrics, it's all in the metrics because, at the moment they're really small. And even at the state level, they're worse. Like in Utah, they're 1 or 2 years that they're measuring it. And, the data does show, for example, like humanities graduates out earn, engineering graduates over the long term, but not over the short term. And so I think the measurements of ROI are difficult. And I think we also need to shift more attention to what universities can do to help.
Well, let me talk about a couple of specific data points
Yeah.
that I'm saying, and one of them is early last year, so just over a year ago, the University of North Carolina system, they did a whole study where it wasn't just a static report, but they came up with a live dashboard that looked at return on investments per program across the 16 institutions in the system, what level, what specific major you have. And they collected all this data. I think it was Deloitte, but they also worked with Burning Glass, which is the one that's looking at jobs alignment. So it wasn't a perfect job, but it was comprehensive. And I have to admit, that's part of the problem. I look at the data here and it takes a while to figure out, wait, what's the important thing? And then that raises the question, are any prospective students actually going to data dashboards and making decisions based on this? And is that the actual audience? Like when these discussions come up, is it primarily intended for prospective students? Or should it be interpreted as information for the institutions to help them figure out rebalancing and what they should offer?
I question the value of it being used to determine the value of certain courses and certain providers in higher education, which is one of the angles over here. I think it's kind of useful to have, but I I think even if you're a kind of a, you could potentially be a parent looking at that when your kid's making a choice for university. I just think there's so much nuance to people's journeys through a degree and out the other side that unless you do something very, very complex and very, very time consuming, the metric isn't going to necessarily help with that. I think that kind of post course completion kind of stuff, I think to your point, Phil, is probably more useful to a university, allied to maybe a government approach that's kind of a bit more of a carrot around, ways in which they can have a stronger focus on employability or shape a portfolio around the needs of a nation and the skills needs. So I think it could go hand in hand with that. But as a measure of the value of university and the merits of a particular course or provider, I just think it's too complex for that to be made valuable.
I think the value is for the university itself as a sort of kick in the pants to get moving. You know, I don't think parents are going to be looking at it. I don't think students are going to be looking at it. It may be used as a political cudgel to beat certain unpopular kinds of things. But I certainly know one university where the president, as it happens, came out of a business school where they typically do work with students to actually prepare for what comes after. And he was horrified about what kinds of salaries students from the humanities and the arts were making. So he actually threw some energy and some money into helping prepare them better as well. So, helping them with things like resume preparation and internships and those sorts of things. So I think there's value there, because typically it's business and engineering. Everybody else is just on their own. Go, good luck with that.
We talk about it being used as a cudgel. I think it gets used the opposite way as well. So go read the executive summary of the UNC system, and it's saying their key summary, which is what a lot of people take away from these things, not looking at the details, is 93% of programs have a positive return on investment. And that proves the value of a UNC education. And so it's actually promotional the way it's been written up. The problem is, first of all, even if you accept the metrics, you're saying 7% of the degrees, even if students graduate, is not going to pay off over the lifetime. And a further 3, maybe up to 7%, if you look at the data, they might be positive, but they're barely above positive at all. So what you're saying is essentially 10% of our programs aren't going to pay off, even if you get your degree. But they frame it only in the positive stakes and not in terms of, hey, we need to either rebalance our portfolio or get into what you're mentioning, Morgan, which is we need to have more of a focus on helping our students actually get rewarding jobs within this field. And it detracts from that. So it's not just a cudgel, it's also a PR tool way too often.
Yeah, but I would say certainly over here, that's driven by there being too much heat in this discussion. I think that's my personal view.
There is a lot of heat, yes.
Because it's become, the political angle has been to kind of attack universities. And I think, I think we've all been critical of universities' ability to kind of change and adapt and evolve and all that kind of side of things. So I'm not kind of defending universities per se, but I think if you're attacked, you're going to respond in those ways, and it's a shame that I think that results in that kind of back and forth rather than something that's a bit more grown up that says, because I think some of these things are driven by the state of the country. I don't think, I don't think things were necessarily better in the past, but I think the kind of the underlying conditions were different. The economy was different. The kind of zeitgeist of what we felt we needed around skills is different. I think in the UK, immigration plays a bit of a part in this in terms of training up people that aren't from other countries to come and do jobs. So I think there are a range of kind of now factors that influence this. But I do think the political angle does not lead to that productive a discussion and debate, because you have governments kicking universities, then you have the UK PR fluff pieces around this kind of thing, and you need something more substantial than that.
There's also not a nuanced conversation about the other side. So often university is put forward as, the trades are put forward as an alternative to the university. Just today in some of the trade press, there was an article about how Gen Z is opting for the trades rather than universities. And nobody sort of looks at, how hard it is on people's bodies, about what levels of unemployment and uncertainty exist in those kinds of things. It's though the only one we're going to look at is higher ed for an ROI. What about the other kinds of things? So, it's not perfect there. And
well, too many of my relatives, particularly who worked in the trades, they hear, "Oh, Phil, you're an electrical engineer. I've got this problem with the house." And I have to say, no. I'm not a useful type of engineer. I could tell you if you have like terminated cables affecting the image quality on this, but nothing useful for making things work. But I'm picking up a difference, and maybe I'm overstating this, but it sounds like in the UK, there's more of a using this to attack, and it's almost one side, right versus left. I'm not sure if that's accurate. In the US, part of what's different is both sides are using it as a cudgel against higher education. And not everybody's represented by left-right. But, I mean, you do have the gainful employment and the following regulations that were used primarily by people on the left and looking for predators. It always frames the discussion as there are institutions that are predatory. They intend to take advantage of students, and let's catch them and hold them accountable. What you're seeing more from the right recently does have the political angle of higher education at large has gone off the rails. But then it's trying to look at, well, if we want to get control over rising tuition and student debts, they need to have skin in the game, incentivize them to lower their own tuition. So more of a market forces kind of argument. And I realize I'm oversimplifying, but they're taking it from both directions, I guess, is part of what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think things are changing here, because I think there was definitely from the Conservative government, there was a bit more of the kind of culture war. Like, I think we know that, in terms of the political spectrum, universities are kind of on, are predominantly on one end of the spectrum. So when you have a government that's on the other end of the spectrum and is scrutinizing higher education, the kind of culture war element comes into it. I think things are taking shape a bit more over here in terms of the government's focus on the kind of economic priorities, and we've got a new kind of body called Skills England. So I think it will be it will be universities needing to change, needing to improve in terms of return on investment, but also universities needing to be more aligned with the kind of skills agenda that the country has and the government has. So it's slightly different. I think it's slightly different because of the road that we've been on to get here. You know, in the UK, you often look back. I mentioned the kind of Blair targets of, you know, so one of the questions is, you know, actually, do we need that many people in universities? The kind of erosion of the polytechnics and the kind of vocational side of things, and then becoming, you know, universities. So we have a kind of a different narrative because of the road that we've been on. But I think the scrutiny's still there, but I think it will become a bit more around, look, we need to go in this direction as a country and you have to come with us. And if you don't, you know, we've already seen kind of cuts in certain funding, and I think we'll start to see that approach in which, you know, universities will be incentivized or cajoled to go in a certain direction around particular skills needs and kind of industry needs, which isn't quite the same as return on investment, but it is about degrees and programs that are delivering for the country. And you would hope that that would come with, you know, decent salaries at the end of it, and a students feeling that they've got a return on investment.
A key area for me is, do the metrics actually support what you're saying? And are you leading to unintended consequences? So a lot of what I look at is that way. And so I'm critical across the board of the data policy proposals for how to measure this if it's used for institutional accountability. Whereas I find it's more useful if it's more of an information that's used to help rebalance portfolios or track if we're moving in the right direction. That's different than saying this institution or this program needs to be held accountable and lose funding, payback, clawbacks, as you were saying last time, Morgan, or not. But given all of this messiness, it's happening. In other words, certainly in the US, I don't think there's going to be pushback and then nothing is happening. It's just a matter of how does it get implemented. It's just a rolling train. I'm not as familiar with the UK, but if that's accurate, then the question is, what are the implications of this move to using return on investment so often in policy circles? So what do you think is going to happen in higher education in the UK because of this move, at least in the short to midterm? Let's just say 3 to 7 years.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I don't think it's going to go away. I think one of the things that comes to my mind is a slight degree of risk around this kind of thing for two different reasons. Firstly, the scrutiny that we're talking about at the moment, but secondly, the kind of financial plight that universities find themselves in, because you already see universities shaping their portfolio around higher demand subject areas because they can't sustain lower demand subject areas. And whilst to a certain extent I've got some sympathy with moving in that direction and the necessity to move in that direction, I think we've talked in the past with Morgan around, you know, some degrees just have to die. My worry is that the combination of the financial constraints that universities have and that return on investment means that there's a risk that portfolios become too similar across universities and everyone kind of flocks to areas where they feel that they can get good outcomes in terms of job, and it's a kind of higher demand areas. I think the other thing that we haven't really talked about as much is also the kind of adult learning, reskilling and retraining side of things, and I think that will also influence portfolio direction in terms of subject areas, but also in terms of kind of shorter offerings as well. So I think that will also play into this. So I think one risk is that universities go all in on high demand areas and areas where they can perceive that there's going to be a better result on return on investment. The other area is kind of the way in which portfolios may change in terms of different kind of offerings focused on the upskilling and reskilling side of things, and it would be interesting to see what happens in terms of policy and scrutiny around that kind of form of provision. That would be really, really interesting. So, yeah, I think there's a danger in this policy, but I think portfolios will change as a result, and it won't just be degrees.
I think this issue is here to stay for the short to medium term. So I think it's going to continue to be a huge issue, and we need to come to terms with it. Like higher ed needs to figure it out, and sort of own the future in a way. A bit of a philosophical point. It's sort of fascinating to me. In a way, over the last 20 years, we've seen the shift of education shift from being a public good to a private good, in a way. And now this is sort of spinning it. Okay, it's a private good, but there's also a public aspect to it, in a sort of weird way there. So there's an interesting thing there for me. But also we keep talking about portfolio, like high demand areas, less demand areas, and it needs to be deeper than that, because not all computer science programs are created equal. Not all engineers are created equal. You can be very different there. And like a good friend of mine's son was doing computer science at a major flagship institution, but he just said, nobody there has been in the industry for 25 years. Like, it's got nothing to do with anything. So he moved to a much less prestigious place, but where it's much more connected to the kinds of stuff that's going on, and he gets languages that are much more useful for him and things. So it needs to be deeper than just the name of the major, I think, and hopefully it won't just be at that level of what are the majors. We need to look at how we prepare students. So Neil mentioned adult learning, and I think that's really important. But I think also this tendency for students to do micro-credentials at the same time is a critical part of that, and should be part of the solution, so that you get a way of hitting the ground running with a shorter term thing as well as your longer term thinking. So I think there needs to be a more qualitative focus as well, rather than just on money, and rather just on the name of the major.
I think that's a really interesting point, because I think another area that's not scrutinized as much as I think it should be is the credibility of certain academics to teach courses, and how up to date they are, and how attuned they are to what's happening in their industries. I feel like, and I don't know if this is as a consequence of my music education background, but when I'm looking at, when I was looking at courses way back when, I'm looking at the experience of the tutors. Okay, which jazz musicians, my tutor played with Charlie Hayden, a great jazz bass player in the US who went through all the three jazz movement. You look at the credentials of I don't know if that's my background, but I look at the credentials, who've they played with, what have they done? And, I think that is relevant to the return on investment side of things. And sometimes, I look and I kind of think, well, you've done some research, or you've kind of you got to this kind of level, but what credentials have you got in these areas? And you see things like universities spinning out courses in AI and things like that, and it has crossed my mind of thinking, well, given the nature of how fast these things are moving, to what extent can we really say with any confidence that some of the academics that are going to be teaching on these programs have got the relevant experience to deliver them, and to deliver them in a way that supports kind of graduate employability and kind of alignment with industry. So I think, that is a really, really important, just the final thought. I remember working in a business school, and we had a hugely popular academic in marketing who got great student reviews because he's very charismatic, but all of the case studies and all of the stuff in the curriculum was incredibly dated. So I think there is an element of this debate, which is how well equipped are academics in terms of industry alignment and outcomes as well.
So I take this conversation as you two actually not just disagreeing with my point that I had said earlier. It depends on which level this is used, and where the problem quite often is when you try to target this institution and this program. That's where the data gets too messy. But really, what you two are saying is that's a flawed view of mine, that you need this to be set up so that individual programs, some will succeed, some won't in this environment, which allows for these differences you two are talking about. Well, this program, it's not a dated curriculum. This program, they do support students in a different way. So you need specific institution and specific program accountability in order to capture those things. Otherwise, and I'm arguing against my previous position, otherwise you end up in a Soviet 5-year planning exercise. Let's figure out which majors are needed across the country over the next 5 years. So you guys have argued me out of my Soviet position before. But here's what I hope happens. It's a little bit more aspirational. I'm starting to look at the current Republican proposals for accountability, and most of the problems are not conceptual. They're in the data themselves. And is this even workable? But they have this type of mechanism where there's a feedback loop. Well, if you want to do better, help your students get better jobs. And it's got a mechanism what's in there. I'm hoping that what's going to happen is it's just going to be ugly for several years, but in a broader sense, it's going to move us into a much healthier place of people routinely looking at what happens to students in this program after they get out of there. So I don't know if I'm predicting it or just hoping it, but it's going to be ugly at the data and unintended consequences level, which we've written about a lot.
Like,
but it's going to be good.
Who's the guy with the thing? If a metric becomes, if you introduce a metric and it becomes important, people will find a way to address the metric in ways. So law schools have been doing that for years. The ranking of a law school in the U.S. depends on the number of students it graduates who are in a job that requires a law degree. So when the law industry started being soft, many law schools were just hiring their own students for 2 years, which is the period of time that they measured, so that they could say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of the reverse, and what the positive view is, the Edward Deming view is if you want to work on it, you better measure it.
Yeah.
You're describing the opposite sense. If you measure it, people will game the system, and not always in the ways that you want it to happen. So I think that there's a follow-up to this conversation. I think this provides a good overall view. It's not going away. It's going to have some unintended consequences. The politics get in the way. It's interesting to hear the differences between the U.S. and the U.K., as always. So thanks for the conversation, and we will talk to you guys. The next time we'll be looking at the interview with Rajay and how online education has progressed differently and similarly between the U.S. and the U.K. That's what the interview is about. And then we'll get back to the exciting world of LMSs and VLEs.